The radio operator's hand froze mid-turn. Static tore through his headset like splintering glass. Somewhere in the dark channel night, 11 men flew blindly through clouds so thick they could not see their own wingtips. They had fuel for only 20 minutes. No sight of the coast, no heading, no way home. He was 19 years old, and what he did in the next 3 minutes would either save them or send them into the sea. March 1944, RAF Coltishall, Norfolk. The East Anglian sky hung low and gray, pressed down by a blanket of coastal weather that stubbornly refused to lift. Mosquito bombers returned from daylight precision raids over occupied Europe in ragged formations, their Merlin engines dopplering through the mist before the airframes punched through the cloud base at 200 feet. Some days they came back riddled with holes. Some days they did not return at all. Inside the radio hut, the air smelled of tobacco, sweat, and hot vacuum tubes. Equipment racks hummed with electric warmth. Morse keys tapped out rhythms that sounded almost musical until one remembered that each cluster of dots and dashes could be a mayday. Operators hunched over their benches, headsets clamped over one ear, pencils scratching call signs and vectors onto damp notepads. Outside, the wind rattled the corrugated tin roof. Navigation over the North Sea was mathematics and trust. Pilots dead reckoned using compass, airspeed, and elapsed time. They calculated drift from the wind. They estimated fuel consumption. They hoped the numbers aligned. When the weather closed in, when clouds stretched from wavetop to 10,000 feet, those numbers became articles of faith. A 5-degree error sustained for 30 minutes could put a crew 15 miles off course. 15 miles was the difference between landfall and drowning. Radio direction finding stations lined the English coast. Each transmitted a call sign on medium frequency. An aircraft with a loop antenna could take bearings, triangulate, and fix its position. In theory. In practice, the system depended on atmospheric cooperation. Clouds distorted signals. Electrical storms scattered them. The ionosphere bent them in ways no one fully understood. On the worst days, a pilot requesting a fix received 2 bearings that contradicted each other by 40 degrees. Then there was the human factor, experience, fatigue, fear. The senior operators at Coltishall were men in their 30s, pre-war telegraph engineers and merchant radio officers who had transferred to the RAF when the need became urgent. They worked with the calm of those who had done this 1,000 times. They knew which frequencies propagated best at dawn. They knew how to read the fading signal of a damaged aircraft losing altitude. They knew the sound of a pilot trying to stay composed when his fuel gauges read empty. The junior operators learned by observation. They took the quiet shifts, the milk runs, the routine checks. They were told to follow procedure. Stick to the manual. Do not improvise. Radio discipline existed for a reason. Every transmission had to be logged. Every frequency change had to be authorized. The system functioned because everyone followed the system. Among the junior operators was a young man whose name would appear in station logs but seldom in histories. He was thin, pale, with a face that looked unfinished, as though adulthood had not yet arrived. His uniform was always slightly rumpled. His handwriting was difficult to read. He had arrived at Coltishall 5 months earlier with only passing marks in Morse and radio theory, no operational experience, and a habit of asking questions that irritated his instructors. The older men barely tolerated him. He lacked the easy confidence of the pre-war professionals. He did not drink with them in the mess. He did not joke. He spent his off-duty hours at his bench dismantling receiver circuits, measuring component values, sketching modifications in a notebook he kept folded in his breast pocket. He listened to frequencies outside his assigned range. He tuned through the noise between channels as if searching for something only he could hear. They called him the tinkerer, not affectionately. When he proposed an idea during a briefing, the room went silent in the way rooms do when someone has overstepped. The senior operator glanced at him, then away, continuing as if nothing had been said. Later, in the corridor, a flight sergeant offered advice. Stay in your lane. Do your job. Do not waste the time of men who had forgotten more about radio than you will ever know. He nodded, said nothing, returned to his bench. But the problem did not disappear. Aircraft were still getting lost. Crews were still dying within sight of home, fuel exhausted, descending through cloud with no visual reference and no reliable bearing. The direction-finding network did its best, but its best was insufficient. The weather was too erratic, the equipment too temperamental, the margins too thin. Every week, another empty chair in the mess. Every week, another search called off. The young operator kept listening, kept sketching, kept tuning through the static. Then one night in late March, the weather collapsed. He had been born in the Midlands, in a town whose primary industry was manufacturing electrical components for the post office. His father assembled telephone exchanges. His mother worked in the winding shop, coiling inductors by hand under flickering workshop lights. The house smelled of solder flux and machine oil. Dinner conversation revolved around resistance values and transformer hum. He was a quiet child, not exactly shy but inward. He built crystal radio sets from scraps before he was 10. He learned Morse by listening to coastal stations at night, copying weather reports and shipping traffic onto scraps of paper he kept in a biscuit tin under his bed. While other boys played football, he sat in the garden shed with headphones clamped over his ears, tuning through the shortwave bands, logging distant transmissions in a cramped, meticulous hand. School bored him. The subjects moved too slowly. The teachers taught from memory rather than curiosity. He passed exams without effort and forgot the material immediately afterward. The only subject that held his attention was physics. Not the curriculum version with inclined planes and frictionless pulleys, but the real physics of antennas and waveguides, of how electromagnetic fields propagated through space, bending around obstacles and fading with distance. At 16, he took a job as a junior technician at the local post office engineering depot. He repaired trunkline amplifiers and carrier frequency equipment, work that required patience and an intuitive grasp of circuit behavior. He was good at it. The senior engineers noticed they gave him harder problems. He solved them quietly without fuss and moved on. When the war came, he was 18. He could have stayed in reserved occupation. Telecommunications were essential. He would have been exempt from conscription. Instead, he volunteered for the RAF. Not out of patriotism, exactly. Not out of a desire for adventure. He volunteered because the RAF had radios everywhere in every theater, operating under every condition, and he wanted to understand them all. Basic training nearly broke him. He was not built for parade ground discipline. He could not march in step. His salute was hesitant. His boots were never quite polished to standard, but he could disassemble and reassemble a transmitter blindfolded. He could copy Morse at 30 words per minute without error. He could diagnose a faulty stage in a receiver by the quality of the noise it produced. The instructors passed him. He requested assignment to a bomber station somewhere operational, somewhere the radios mattered. They sent him to Kulturau. He arrived in October 1943 in the middle of a cold snap that turned the airfield into a basin of standing water and frozen mud. The mosquitoes flew regardless. Fast low-level strikes into Germany and occupied France. Precision targets, Gestapo headquarters, railway junctions, VW weapon sites. The crews launched at dawn and returned at dusk or did not return at all. The radio hut never slept. His first week was overwhelming. The operational tempo, the noise, the constant pressure of lives depending on clarity and speed. He made mistakes, transposed call signs, missed transmissions. Once he gave a bearing that was 10 degrees off because he misread his own handwriting. The pilot corrected him politely and he felt the heat of shame crawl up his neck, but he learned. He watched the senior operators. He noted which techniques worked and which did not. He realized that radio work under operational conditions was less about textbook procedure and more about pattern recognition. The sound of a steady pilot versus a panicked one. The cadence of Morse sent by a tired hand. The subtle distortion in a signal that suggested the transmitter was damaged or the aircraft was low on electrical power. He also began to notice inconsistencies. Aircraft reporting the same position would receive different bearings from different direction-finding stations. Crews inbound on clear nights would request fixes and get responses that made no geometric sense. The system was not broken exactly. It was unreliable in ways that defied prediction. He started keeping a private log. He noted weather conditions, time of day, signal strength, and bearing accuracy. He cross-referenced reports. Patterns emerged. Certain atmospheric conditions correlated with bearing errors. Certain frequencies were more stable than others. The discrepancies were not random. They were systematic. One evening, after a long shift, he approached the senior operator with his notebook. He pointed out the correlations, suggested that they might improve accuracy by switching frequencies based on real-time atmospheric conditions rather than sticking to the assigned channel. The senior operator glanced at the notebook, then at him, and closed it without reading further. "We follow the manual," the older man said. "It's how we stay coordinated, but the manual does Not account for the manual, the senior operator repeated, is not optional. He took his notebook back, said nothing, returned to his bench. But the idea would not leave him. It sat in his mind like a frequency he could not tune out. The problem was older than the war. Electromagnetic waves do not travel in straight lines, they bend, reflect, refract. The same laws that govern light apply, but radio wavelengths are longer, more easily disturbed by the atmosphere. A signal transmitted from a coastal station passes through layers of air with varying temperature, pressure, and humidity. Each boundary bends the wave slightly. At night, the ionosphere descends, reflecting medium-frequency signals back to Earth at steep angles. During storms, electrical discharge scatters the wave front into chaos. Direction-finding equipment measures the angle at which a signal arrives. The measurement depends on the assumption that the signal traveled in a straight line from transmitter to receiver. If the signal has been bent by atmospheric refraction, the bearing is wrong. If the signal has bounced off the ionosphere, the bearing is worse than useless. It is confidently incorrect. The engineers knew this. They had known it since the first radio navigation experiments in the 1920s. They built the system anyway because it was better than nothing. Most of the time it worked well enough. Most of the time was not the problem. The problem was the exceptions. March 1944 was a month of exceptions. A high-pressure system stalled over the North Sea, trapping cold air beneath a warmer layer of loft. The inversion created a duct, a horizontal waveguide that trapped radio signals and carried them far beyond their normal range. Stations in Scotland could hear transmissions from the Channel Islands. Aircraft requesting bearings from Cultura received responses from stations 200 m away. Their signals arriving stronger than the local transmitter. Bearings became meaningless. Pilots triangulated their positions and found themselves plotted in the middle of the sea, miles from any possible flight path. Some ignored the fixes and navigated by dead reckoning. They made it home. Others trusted the system and flew the headings they were given. They did not make it home. On the night of March 23, 6 Mosquitoes launched for a raid on a Rylard near Amy. Weather was marginal. Cloud base at 800 feet, tops at 12,000. Visibility below cloud less than 2 miles. The raid went as planned. Bombs on target. No losses. The aircraft turned for home. Halfway across the channel, the cloud thickened. Tops rose to 15,000 feet. The Mosquitoes climbed above it, cruising at 18,000 in clear air under a field of stars. They could see the moon. They could see each other's navigation lights. They could not see the ground. They called for bearings. Cultish all responded. The fixes placed them south of their actual position by nearly 20 m. The pilots corrected their heading and flew north. The error compounded. By the time they crossed the English coast, they were over the Wash instead of Norfolk, drifting further off course with each passing minute. Fuel gauges swung toward empty. The lead pilot requested an emergency vector. Cultura transmitted a heading. The pilot followed it. The heading led them further north away from the airfield, toward the cold black expanse of the Lincolnshire fence. One by one, the Mosquitoes began descending through cloud, searching for visual reference. One by one, they vanished from radio contact. 3 crews found breaks in the cloud and landed at unfamiliar airfields, their tanks nearly dry. 2 others belly landed in fields, wheels up, guided down by instinct and luck. 1 crew did not make it. The Mosquito struck a line of trees at 180 miles per hour. Both men died on impact. The wreckage burned through the night. The accident investigation found no mechanical failure, no pilot error. The aircraft had been serviceable. The crew had been experienced. The cause of death was listed as controlled flight into terrain due to navigational uncertainty, which meant the system had failed them, which meant it could fail again. The station commander called a meeting. The senior operators attended. The young radio operator sat in the back listening. The discussion circled the same points. Atmospheric propagation was unpredictable. Direction finding accuracy degraded under certain conditions. There was no reliable way to know when those conditions existed. The Best they could do was continue following procedure and hope the weather improved. The young operator raised his hand. The room turned to look at him. The station commander nodded. He stood awkward, clutching his notebook. He explained that the problem was not the equipment, it was the single frequency protocol. The assigned channel was vulnerable to ionospheric reflection during temperature inversions. If they monitored propagation in real time and switched to a frequency that was currently stable, they could maintain bearing accuracy even in poor conditions. The senior operator frowned. How would you monitor propagation in real time? By listening, the young operator said, by comparing signal characteristics on multiple frequencies and selecting the one with the least distortion. That would require constant frequency changes. The senior operator said it would break coordination with other stations. It would confuse the pilots. Not if we brief them in advance. Not if we establish a secondary frequency as a backup. The station commander leaned back in his chair. And you believe this would work? I do not know, the young operator said, but I think it is worth testing. The room went silent. The station commander looked at the senior operator. The senior operator shook his head very slightly. We will take it under advisement, the station commander said. Thank you for your input. The meeting adjourned. The young operator returned to his bench. No one spoke to him for the rest of the shift. But that night, alone in the radio hut, he began sketching a protocol, step by step, frequency by frequency, a map of what might be possible if someone was willing to try. He did not have authorization. He did not have approval. He had a theory and a quiet desperation that felt to him like the only reasonable response to watching men die from solvable problems. He waited for a night when the senior operator was off duty. He waited for a shift when the weather was bad but not catastrophic. He waited for a moment when the risk of trying felt smaller than the cost of doing nothing. It came. On April 2nd, the forecast predicted scattered thunderstorms over the North Sea, cloud cover 8/10 moderate turbulence below 10,000 feet. A mosquito strike package was inbound from the Dutch coast. Estimated time of arrival just after midnight. Routine, manageable, the sort of operation that happened a dozen times a month. The young operator was assigned to the auxiliary position, monitoring the secondary frequency in case the primary channel became congested. It was a quiet job. Most nights, nothing happened. He wore his headset and listened to static, but tonight he tuned through the spectrum, checking signal quality on multiple frequencies. He noted which bands were stable and which were disturbed by electrical noise from the distant storms. He wrote down propagation characteristics, signal strength, fading patterns. He built a mental map of which frequencies were currently reliable and which were not. The strike package called in on schedule. 6 aircraft, all reporting normal fuel state, all requesting bearings for final approach. The primary operator acknowledged and began coordinating with the direction-finding stations. The bearings came back inconsistent. One station placed the formation 10 miles south of the airfield. Another placed them 15 miles north. The discrepancy was too large to be instrument error. The primary operator requested confirmation. The stations repeated their bearings, still inconsistent. The lead pilot asked for clarification. His voice was calm, but edged with the flatness of a man doing arithmetic in his head, calculating fuel against distance, and not liking the answer. The primary operator hesitated, transmitted a best guess vector, told the pilot to stand by for further instructions. The young operator keyed his microphone on the secondary frequency. He had no authority to transmit. He did it anyway. He told the lead pilot to switch to the alternate frequency. He told him the primary channel was unstable due to atmospheric conditions. He told him he could provide more accurate bearings if the pilot trusted him for the next 5 minutes. There was a pause. Then the pilot rogered and switched frequencies. The young operator took a breath, adjusted his receiver, selected a frequency in the lower part of the medium wave band, one he had determined was propagating cleanly with minimal ionospheric distortion. He contacted a direction-finding station directly bypassed the normal coordination protocol and requested a bearing on the new frequency. The station responded. The bearing was Sharp, confident, the operator cross-checked with a second station. The bearings agreed within 2 degrees. He transmitted the corrected heading to the pilot, told him to descend to 3,000 ft and look for the airfield beacon at 10 miles. The pilot acknowledged. The formation turned. 8 minutes later, the mosquitoes broke through cloud base. The beacon was directly ahead, exactly where it should have been. The aircraft landed. One after another, clean approaches, no drama. The crews shut down their engines and climbed out into the drizzle, tired and cold and alive. The young operator logged the event in his notebook, said nothing to anyone, returned to monitoring the secondary frequency as though nothing unusual had happened. But the lead pilot filed a report. He praised the accuracy of the bearings. He noted the professionalism of the operator on the alternate frequency. He recommended combination. The station commander read the report. Then he called the young operator into his office. The office was small and smelled of pipe tobacco. A single window looked out over the airfield. Rain streaked the glass. The station commander sat behind a desk piled with maps and requisition forms. He gestured for the young operator to sit. He asked what had happened. No reprimand in his tone, just curiosity. The young operator explained the frequency instability, the propagation analysis, the decision to bypass protocol in favor of real-time adaptation. He spoke quietly, factually, without embellishment. He expected to be disciplined, possibly reassigned. He did not regret it. The station commander listened. When the young operator finished, the older man leaned back and tapped his pipe against the ashtray. He asked if the technique could be taught, if it could be standardized, if it could be made reliable enough to use operationally. The young operator said he believed so, but it would require changes, flexibility in frequency assignment, training for the operators, coordination with the direction-finding network. It would require trust. The station commander nodded slowly. He told the young operator to write it up, a full protocol, step by step, assumptions, procedures, contingencies. He wanted it on his desk in 48 hours. The young operator returned to his quarters. He did not sleep. He wrote, the protocol he drafted was not elegant. It was pragmatic. It began with the assumption that atmospheric conditions could not be predicted, but could be monitored. Operators would maintain continuous awareness of propagation quality on multiple frequencies. When conditions on the primary channel degraded, they would switch to a predecided alternate. Pilots would be briefed on the procedure during mission planning. The direction-finding stations would be notified in advance and prepared to respond on multiple channels. The system depended on operator judgment. It could not be reduced to a checklist. It required experience, situational awareness, and the willingness to act without waiting for permission. It was, in other words, exactly the sort of thing that institutional procedures were designed to prevent. The station commander read the protocol. He forwarded it to Group Headquarters. Group forwarded it to Command. Command assigned a signals officer to evaluate it. The signals officer arrived at Kultashaw a week later. He was a pre-war academic, a physicist who had spent the 30s studying radio propagation in the Arctic. He interviewed the young operator for 2 hours, asked detailed technical questions, reviewed the logs, examined the frequency charts. At the end of the interview, he told the young operator that theory was sound, but the implementation would be resisted. Institutional inertia was a force more powerful than logic. He also said that the war had no patience for perfect solutions, only workable ones. He authorized a trial period, 30 days. The young operator would be permitted to use his adaptive frequency protocol on a provisional basis. If bearing accuracy improved, the protocol would be formalized. If it did not, it would be discontinued and the young operator would return to standard procedure. The trial began on April 15. For the first week, nothing dramatic happened. The weather was good. Aircraft navigated by visual reference. The radios were back up. The young operator monitored propagation, logged conditions, refined his intuition for which frequencies were stable and which were not. Then the weather turned. A low-pressure system swept in from the Atlantic, bringing Rain and fog that blanketed the coast for 5 days. Cloud base dropped to 200-foot visibility, fell below a mile. Operations continued. The bombers flew. The radios became primary. The young operator worked 18-hour shifts. He monitored frequencies continuously, switching channels as conditions shifted, coordinating with the direction. Finding stations, guiding aircraft home through MC that would have been impassable a month earlier. The bearings held. The crews landed safely. The system worked. Word spread. Other stations began experimenting with adaptive frequency protocols. The signals officer returned to Kulturaw and observed operations for 3 days. He filed a report recommending immediate adoption across the bomber groups. By May, the protocol was standard procedure. By June, it had been incorporated into training. By the time of the Normandy landings, every radio operator in Bomber Command had been briefed on adaptive frequency navigation. The technique had a name now: real-time propagation management. It sounded official, institutional, safe, but the operators still called it the tinkerer's trick. The statistics were compiled after the war when analysts had time to sift through operational records and compare survival rates across different periods. The data showed a measurable decline in navigational losses beginning in the spring of 1944. Aircraft that would have been written off as missing in action instead returned safely. Crews that would have ditched in the North Sea instead made emergency landings on friendly soil. The improvement was not dramatic. It did not alter the course of the war, but it was real. Approximately 60 aircraft were saved between April and August 1944 due to more accurate radio bearings during adverse weather. That translates to 120 airmen who came home. 120 men who lived because a 19-year-old radio operator decided that procedure was less important than results. The technique spread beyond Bomber Command. Coastal Command adopted it for anti-submarine patrols. Transport Command used it for supply runs over the Himalayas. Even the Americans took notice. A liaison officer from the 8th Air Force visited Kultishaw in July and spent 2 days learning the protocol. He returned to his base and implemented it immediately. The young operator was promoted to sergeant. He was assigned to train new radio operators in adaptive techniques. He was for a brief period the subject of attention he neither sought nor enjoyed. He gave lectures, answered questions, demonstrated equipment. He did it competently but without enthusiasm. He preferred the night shifts when the radio hut was quiet and the work was listening rather than talking. In September, he was transferred to a signals research unit in Buckinghamshire. They were developing new navigation aids for the final push into Germany. Precision bombing required precision navigation. The young operator's insight into real-time propagation analysis made him valuable. He spent the last year of the war in a laboratory testing prototypes and writing technical reports. He never flew a combat mission, never fired a weapon, never saw the enemy except as a distant abstraction in briefing papers. But the men who did fly, who did fight, who did return, returned in part because of him. After the war, the citations were filed and mostly forgotten. A few lines in station logs, a mention in a signals officer's memoir, a footnote in a technical manual on radio navigation. His name appeared in none of the popular histories. The historians wrote about the pilots and the bombers and the targets. The infrastructure that brought them home was invisible, but the pilots remembered. Years later, at reunions and commemorations, old men would tell stories about the night they were lost over the channel, fuel running out, clouded down to the deck, and a calm voice on the radio guided them home with a bearing that made no sense according to the map, but turned out to be exactly right. They did not know his name, they called him the voice, the one who knew. He left the service in 1946 with the rank of flight sergeant in a war that had taught him the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge was understanding how radio waves propagate. Wisdom was knowing when to set the manual aside. He returned to the Midlands and took a job with the General Post Office, installing microwave relay stations for the new trunk telephone network. The work was solitary. He traveled the country, climbing hills and moors, surveying sites, aligning antennas with quiet precision. He was good at it. The systems he installed remained in service for decades. He married late, had 2 children, and lived in a semi-detached house on a quiet street where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen. He did not speak about the war. When his son asked years later what he had done, he replied that he had been a radio operator. Nothing special, the son pressed. The father shrugged and shifted the topic. He passed away in 1987 from heart failure at the age of 63. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his career with the post office and his service in the RAF. It did not note that he had saved lives. It did not mention that he had transformed the way an entire command navigated at night. It did not record that his willingness to challenge authority had created a system others used without knowing its origin. Yet the system endured. The principle he demonstrated, that strict adherence to procedure can be less effective than adaptive responses to real-time conditions, became a cornerstone of military communications. Modern aviation navigation relies on systems that constantly monitor signal quality and automatically switch frequencies. The technology is advanced, the insight remains unchanged. He would likely have appreciated the irony that his improvisation became institutionalized, that his defiance hardened into doctrine. The war produced countless heroes. Many are remembered: statues, medals, memorial plaques. But some heroism is quieter. Some courage manifests not in charging into danger, but in refusing to accept that the way things are is the way they must stay, in noticing what others overlook, in acting when action is unauthorized but necessary. On a rainy night in Norfolk, in a radio hut, a young man with no authority and every reason to remain silent chose instead to trust his judgment over the manual. He acted not for recognition, but because the alternative was unacceptable, because procedure, however carefully designed, could not cover every scenario, because the lives depending on him mattered more than the approval of his superiors. He was mocked for tinkering, for questioning, for refusing to accept that the system was sufficient. He was right to refuse. The system was not good enough. It never is. There is always a better way, waiting for someone willing to search for it. The bombers returned. The crews survived. The war pressed on. And the 19-year-old radio operator went back to his bench, put on his headset, and listened for the next signal that only he could hear.